Hello, and welcome to episode 2 of Off the Rails. Joined with me today is...
Lauren Smith.
Alright, Lauren. Are you ready?
I'm very excited. I'm very ready.
You don't know what today's episode is about.
I have no idea.
We were in the basement of the library. We've locked the doors of the chamber. You're ready to learn.
Always.
Alright, good. So, today's story, it's a little bit of a true crime episode, okay?
Okay.
There's no gore.
Great.
Nothing great. It's a real fun crime, I gotta say.
Oh, I love that.
Alright, so...
Love me a good fun crime.
We'll start right into it. Do you have any hobbies?
Yes.
Yeah? What are they? What are your hobbies?
I really love playing Nancy Drew computer games, and I like to embroider, you know.
How far are you willing to go to pursue these hobbies? You know, like, is it a big money investment for you?
Yes, I go pretty far. I try to install an emulator to play Nancy Drew games on my Mac.
Oh, so you're committed.
I'm committed.
Petty crime.
Yes.
So you would commit a crime for your hobbies?
Yes, I would.
All right. Would you perhaps say, break into the British National History Museum to steal millions of dollars worth of exotic birds and then sell them into the black market feather trade in order to buy a golden flute?
You had me up until the golden flute.
So you would break into the museum?
I don't know. I would consider it.
You would consider it?
This cannot be held legally against me, correct?
No.
Okay, then I consider it.
Excellent.
On the record, wouldn't consider it. Off the record?
Off the record?
Yeah.
I'd steal some exotic bird feathers.
Maybe.
Alright, so, a little bit of backstory. Because this crime is real, and it did happen. So let's take it back to 2011. Okay? So there's this kid, and we'll get into more about him in a little bit, but his name is Edwin Rist, and he did break into the British National History Museum, and he stole 299 rare and exotic birds.
Why stop there? Go for 300.
Look, man, he was breaking in, not a lot of time.
That's
we'll get into the specifics of his crime, but just, he is an accomplished flautist, really, really good. He is in America, and then he traveled to Europe to, like, go to the Royal Academy in London, and he performs at all these concerts. He's a big deal. And he is also really into salmon fly tying. And I will explain what that is in a moment. Let me set the scene.
Okay.
So it's 2011, and I've heard of this story from a podcast and a book by this guy Kirk Johnson, who was an Iraq veteran. He did all this stuff, but in his spare time to, like, help, you know, cope with, like, PTSD and all this stuff, he took up fly fishing, which is basically a type of fishing where, you know, it's the ones that have the big, huge cast that they do, this sort of wind up, and they have flies, these lures on their hooks that are meant to look like insects. So there's some that people will make that they'll take, like, rabbit fur. This is what Kirk did for, like, trout fishing. They'll take, like, rabbit fur and tie them around to make, like, these intricate-looking shapes to, like, imitate, like, an insect of some sort, and then cast them, and they're supposed to help lure in the fish to make them think it's like, oh, there's a bug on the surface, let me eat that. And then they get caught. So, you know, the Kirk is out, and he's doing this hobby, and he meets up with this guy to, like, guide him on, like, a tour, you know, to show him the ropes of fly fishing. And, you know, Kirk uses, like, he goes trout fishing, so he makes these sort of brown ones out of, like, rabbit fur. They're not super intense. They're kind of just, like, pretty beginner. All right? But he meets this guy who they're going and they're fishing, and he ends up pulling out these intricate, colorful lures. They are large. There's all sorts of colors, like blue and red, and it looks like more than just like, oh, it's a little tuft of fur. It's like a whole creature has been made on this hook. And he's like, these are salmon fly. These are salmon fly ties. They are meant to catch salmon. They are also sort of just a hobby. People just do this for fun. They find exotic bird feathers and they craft these things. And Kirk's like, that's nuts. Like, why go to all that trouble for something you're just going to throw into a river, you know? And he's like, if you think that's weird, you should hear about this kid, Edwin Rist, all right? He, as I told you, broke into the National History Museum last year, so that was, I believe, about 2009 when he broke in. And these weren't just regular birds that he stole. Like, he didn't just go into the museum and be like, oh, fancy birds. Let me take these. These will be good feathers. These were incredibly rare birds collected by an explorer named Alfred Wallace, who was a scientist who studied animal species and was a friend of Charles Darwin. He actually figured out evolution at about the same time as Darwin. Like, they shared research and stuff. So these birds, they're not just, oh, they've got pretty feathers. They're in this museum. Scientists still use them to study species, to talk about how animals adapt to climates and all that. They're, like, used for climate change. Like, they're important birds.
So are these alive birds?
No, they're dead.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. These when I'm talking about birds or collection or species, these are dead. They've been, like, stuffed and preserved, and so they're in the museum. They're still studied to see, like, birds of then and what birds of now are doing, like, and how these species changed and evolved over the years. But that's not why Edwin wanted them. He did not care.
No.
He broke into the museum solely for their feathers, to sell them to other tyers to buy a flute. He did not give a shit about any of the scientific significance of these birds, which is a little bit, I find it a bit irritating.
Yeah.
Frustrating, honestly. Yeah. Because it's such important work. All right, so let me get a little bit into the history of fly tying, because it's wild. So, basically, Alfred Wallace, when he was doing all this research and he sent these birds back, one of the things he wrote about was how these birds are so beautiful, so magnificent, that he hoped that the West never learned of their existence because they would ruin it. Sort of, in the sense of, like, colonization, they would learn about these birds, they'd be like, oh, these are a commodity, we can sell them, we can take them, they're ours. They would just trample the beauty.
Mm-hmm.
And it's exactly what happened. Once people caught wind that there were these fancy exotic birds in, like, Central America or South Africa or all these places that you could not find in Europe, it became sort of a status thing. Oh, I want a fancy bird. I want, like, a fancy bird on my hat. I want, like, plumage in my, like, blazer or whatever. So in the Victorian era, I'm getting ahead of myself, hold on. Okay, so basically, Victorian era London.
Mm-hmm.
All kinds of, like, you want to show off your status, you want to show off your wealth, you want people to think that you're someone of worth and importance.
Mm-hmm.
And one of those ways people would show that is through fashion. So when people heard about Alfred Wallace and Charles Darwin, but specifically Wallace because he was studying really fancy kinds of birds, once they saw and heard about them, people were like, oh, I need that. That's going to be the thing that's going to, like, pull my outfit together. That's going to be the showstopper. If I walk up and I have a whole, like, bird of paradise on my hat, and someone else is like a robin, I'm better than them.
Yes.
So it became this thing of, like, you got to find the best bird, you got to have more birds, you got to have all this stuff, and it became very elaborate. And so there became this culture of collecting and buying up all these birds, and a thing people began to do was create sort of almost like corsages. They would, like, tie all these intricate designs with different types of feathers together. Like, it wasn't just, oh, I've got a couple bird feathers from, like, a parrot. They'd be like, oh, I've got a parrot. I've got a bird of paradise. I've got this thing. I've got that thing. And they'll tie it into, like, a creature. Like, this part's the horn. This part's the tail. And it became this whole culture of, like, trying to craft these like, magnificent-looking things. And so over the years, not only did they sort of morph from, like, a status symbol into, like, salmon fly tying, but they wiped out, like, whole species, or drove a bunch of them, like, to near extinction, because people just became obsessed with the idea of, like, owning and like, having all of this. They didn't stop to consider the ecological damage that we could be doing. And this was something that Wallace was worried about, because he's, studying evolution, studying all these species, and he understands, like, the beauty of these things. So he's like, I don't want people to get their hands on them. But of course that happens. And so today, these birds are, if they're still around, incredibly protected. You can't just go and kill them if they still exist, because their numbers are incredibly small. So Edwin had the great, fantastic idea, why don't I break into the museum to do it? So, a little background on Edwin, because he is a character. Because, oh my god, he's wild. So, he's born in Albany, New York. And from a very early age, he is a musical prodigy. He starts playing flute very early, and it's just like this thing that consumes him. And so he's playing flute, he's getting really good at it, and at the same time, his father and his mother are journalists, and his father is doing research on fly fishing, like casting physics or something. And Edwin just happens to see a video, like, teaching someone how to tie these ties, and he becomes obsessed instantly. And so he spends all this time with his father and his brother going to like stores and conventions and competitions, learning and just pouring all of his time into learning how to do this thing. And he eventually gets really, really good at it. And he's like winning competitions and all this stuff. And he's meeting like famous like fly tying people. Because of course there's always like the weirdo who like knows how to do all of it. And so he eventually meets people who introduce him to salmon fly tying and show him all the exotic birds. And that's it for him. Like he was obsessed before, but now this has consumed him. He becomes really obsessed with like learning all these recipes, because that's what they're called. The recipes of like, you know, you take this bit of bird, you take this bit of bird. I have a quote here of an example of one of these recipes that he would try and learn how to do. I think this is the first one that he learned how to do. And it's like, the tail calls for feathers from the Indian crow, which is the red rough fruit crow that's all over South America. The butt requires 2 turns of black ostrich hurl. The throat has light blue hackle, usually from the Caatinga, which is from Central America. The wings are a pair of long jungle cock feathers with double tippets on both sides. It is a very elaborate, like, hobby that he has now.
Wow.
Yeah.
You have to have a whole stockpile.
It's not just like, oh, I got some robin. It's, you have to find these incredibly exotic birds that are really expensive. And that's the problem he runs into, is he's like 16. He doesn't really have any money, but he has these 2 incredibly expensive hobbies. Because he wants to buy all these instruments and he wants to buy all these bird feathers. So he starts reaching a point where he's like, I'll do anything to get money to buy them. He starts doing like more chores. He starts helping out neighbors. He's just crazy for these bird feathers. And eventually, he ends up getting accepted to the Royal Academy in London for flute. And he immediately gets all these offers from these orchestras and stuff, and he starts playing around, and he sort of realizes he could have another opportunity, because he's in London, he's in a different space, you know, there's more access. So he's still broke, and he's getting desperate. And he learns of the National History Museum's collection of birds in this little town called Tring. All right? And he's like, oh, I could do something with that. There's all these birds. Maybe there's something here. So he decides to, and in this collection they have both Darwin's finches and Wallace's exotic bird collection. And so he decides, all right, I'm going to go there. So he emails them, and he's like, hey, I got to take some photos of Alfred Wallace's birds for this friend's PhD thesis. Can I come down? And they're like, oh yeah, sure, come down. So he comes in. He uses his full name on the guest logbook. And he comes in and he just takes pictures of the birds. And he gets real into them, and he's like picking apart like the species of like, oh my god, this one could be used for this thing. And not only that, but he takes a bunch of, at the time, seeming innocuous pictures of the museum layout. Just of the space. And so he leaves the museum and he's like, I'm gonna come back. And he literally makes a Microsoft Word document called, it's something along of like museum invasion plan or something like, it's literal. It's so, like, of course he would, because he's like 20. Oh, what are you gonna do? I'm gonna invade a museum. Let me name my document that. Let me lay out my evil plan. So he basically, after playing a concert one night, he comes back to the museum, and he only has a suitcase, latex gloves, a glass cutter, wire clippers, and just a small flashlight. And he's like, I'm gonna break in. He climbs over a wall, cuts a couple of barbed wire things, and then he goes to break into the window, realizes he dropped the glass cutter somewhere and cannot find it. So he just smashes through with a rock and gets in the museum. And the alarm goes off. But the security guards do not notice. Nobody comes to stop him.
Oh my god.
Yeah. Now he claims the museum guard was distracted, like watching a soccer match. The museum, of course, denies this, because that would be a display of gross incompetence.
Yes, that would invite anyone else to do this.
Because Edwin is there for an hour.
Oh my god.
Undisturbed. Now, he goes to the Wallace exhibit. It's really dark. His stupid little flashlight isn't helping much, so he can't really tell what birds are what. So he just starts grabbing them and stuffing them into the suitcase.
Oh my god.
And I'll read you another quote. The Caatingas were small. He bagged 100 of those. The resplendent quetzals, though, were trickier. He had to carefully coil their long tails in order to make them fit. He moved from cabinet to cabinet, sometimes emptying whole drawers, or nearly. He took 47 of the museum's 48 red-ruffed fruit crow. He only left the last one because he didn't see it wedged in the back of the tray. He did not give a shit about what he was doing.
Oh my gosh. I know I gave him a little shit for, oh my god, you couldn't make it to 300. He fit 299 birds in a suitcase?
Yes.
How many suitcases did he, walk out of there with? I'm just trying to visualize this.
Oh, yeah.
Oh my gosh. And the one that got away.
The one that got away. That's the thing. They have interviews with him, and he doesn't like being called a thief. He doesn't really think what he did was wrong. I'm
curious.
I'll continue. It's wild. So, 299 birds, millions of dollars, just gone. He walks out. He's gone.
He's rolling his suitcase behind him.
The broken window was not discovered till the next morning.
Oh my god.
The cops, so the museum calls the cops. Mm-hmm. The cops search the place, and they check all the big value exhibits, including Darwin's finches. They conclude nothing was stolen. They didn't bother to check Alfred Wallace's collection, which kind of makes sense in a sad way. Because, yeah, he discovered evolution, but Darwin was the first one. Mm-hmm. He got pushed to the side. Mm-hmm. They didn't bother to check. They actually did not realize anything was missing for, guess how long?
A week.
A week? 35 days.
Oh my goodness.
Nobody noticed
35 days.
A damn thing. 299 birds, gone. No one noticed a thing. Until someone wrote a letter asking about a particular bird, and a curator went to find it, only to open the drawer and realize it was gone, and that 200 plus birds were missing.
That poor curator.
That poor curator. So, they, honestly, really could have found him super easily. Mm-hmm. When he first visited the museum, he signed in with his full name. If they searched that up, they'd have found his website where he was selling the birds with their Latin names. Very particular. They also, the security footage for CCTV cameras that are around, because in Europe, especially in England, there's a lot of CCTV cameras around, they reset after 28 days.
Wow.
So they just don't have any footage of him. And so they also could have found out from his website that he plays the flute. And if they had been a little more careful, they could have gone onto eBay and seen Flautist 1998 and who's selling these bird feathers. It would have been so easy for them to track it down. But it took them forever. He was finally caught nearly a year later, pretty much a year later, when at almost seeming random, someone at a fly tying festival in the Netherlands saw a bird that looked like one of the missing ones and reported it. And so the police arrested him nearly a year after they stole him. And at first, he was going to be sentenced for how many years, do you think?
35.
35 years. Okay, so it's 10 to 14.
Okay, all right.
10 to 14. I mean, yeah, it's millions of dollars of birds, and it's also research that people use. But while the trial was going on, he was diagnosed with Asperger's. And because England has had, there's, particular laws around, treating people with, I think mental illness or special needs, they, ended up not sentencing him to anything. I think he had, some sort of suspension or penalty and, a fine. He served no time. And there's controversy over whether or not he actually had Asperger's, because when you talk to him, Kirk, the guy who wrote this whole story, talked to him, and he was I didn't display any symptoms before the trial. He said, I became who I needed to be in that moment. Mm-hmm. And so you're wondering, is that really true?
Is that really
Did
true?
he get off with it? So as of now, Edwin is free. He is still playing concerts. He is just walking free.
This is just a blip.
Yeah, it's a blip for him, which is, to me, it's sort of frustrating because, so many birds are still missing. About a third of the birds were managed to return to the museum intact. Mm-hmm. Some of them lost their labels, which if they lose their labels, it sort of loses their scientific value because we don't know, are these real, are they not? Mm-hmm. But a lot of them came back damaged, and so they're sort of just unusable and kind of worthless. Oh but the rest of them, nobody really knows. They could have been sold. They could still be hoarded. People could have tied them into lures. We just don't.
And they could be in the ocean.
They could be in the ocean.
Alert.
They could be in a river. They could be in the back of someone's closet. crushed, like, under, like, some, like, blankets or whatever. Like, nobody knows.
Wow.
Yeah. So, it's one of those things where you think, on one hand, you're like, is that, like, should he go to prison?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. The fact that he hasn't is crazy.
Mm-hmm.
So, that's all I got for you. I want to hear some of your thoughts.
Wow. Okay, so many. And I want to say in the beginning when I said I'd do anything for a new Nancy Drew game, I would not do this. I want to make that very clear. All right, now we can move forward. I'm all for not jailing people who like not a violent crime. The public isn't in any physical danger, but there does need to be some reparation. If you can't get all the birds back, how do we move forward, and how do we recover what was lost? And
it's one of those things where you're like, I don't exactly think he should be in jail, but he shouldn't also just walk away scot-free.
With his flute,
employed. Nobody really knows or cares.
Mm-hmm.
And he really doesn't seem to feel very much remorse about it.
Yes.
When people have talked to him since, they're like, other people he was surrounded with, like, you know, people he, like, sold birds to or whatever, are very, like, conflicted and feel bad about it that they were involved. But, like, Edwin himself, yeah, he doesn't like being called a thief. He doesn't really think what he did was that big of a wrong.
He stole, so he's a
straight
thief,
up.
But
stealing anything, you are a thief.
Yes.
But, like, birds, really exotic birds.
Historically important.
Yeah.
Exotic birds.
So
wow.
Yeah.
I did not know that there were so many intricacies of fly fishing in that.
It's such a crazy thing. I said this is my favorite crime, but then when I think about it, it makes me upset.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's scientific information and history that is just gone. Just because people wanted to tie some fancy fucking lures.
You can go to Party City and you can get little feathers.
Yeah, you get fake feathers. They make fake lures you can buy and sell. You don't need to do this.
You don't need to use exotic birds' rare feathers. Wow.
So that concludes episode 2 of Off the Rails. This was certainly...
Off the rails.
Oh, yeah.
Indeed.
All right.
Thank you so much, Maddie.
You're welcome.